station supports WHYY's Fresh Air and its commitment to sharing ideas and encouraging meaningful conversation. Support for NPR comes from NPR member stations and from Cancer Treatment Centers of America, where nutritional therapy is part of every patient's treatment plan to help boost their immune system and manage side effects during treatment. More about integrative cancer care is available at cancercenter.com. And from Monster, who believes that a small business finds greater success when every candidate hired has passion, tenacity, and grit. Learn more at monster.com. Monster, find better.
Veteran Clinton observer Kim Gattas says the Hillary strategy has always been slow and steady wins the race.
Unlike 2008, they were ready for the long game.
It doesn't mean there haven't been real cliffhangers, though, and how the GOP race reminds her of elections in the developing world and the Middle East. That's next time on The Takeaway, weekday afternoons at 3 on 93.9 FM.
WNYC receives support from the New Jersey Symphony Orchestra. Future music director Shen Zhang leads Tchaikovsky's Fourth and Barber's Violin Concerto featuring Jennifer Frautschi, April 7th through 10th at NJ Pack, Red Bank, and Morristown. Tickets at njsymphony.org.
You're listening to Fresh Air with Terry Gross on WNYC. Coming up next, it's The Takeaway on 93.9 FM, and on AM 820, it's The World.
This is Fresh Air. I'm Terry Gross, back with Adam Hochschild. We're talking about his new book, Spain in Our Hearts, about Americans who volunteered to fight against fascism during the Spanish Civil War, which lasted from 1936 to 39. World War II began just a few months later. Hitler and Mussolini had supported the fascist side in Spain, which was led by General Francisco Franco, who became Spain's ruler until his death in 1975. In writing about the journalists who covered the Spanish Civil War, you also write a little bit about how it was covered in the United States. And you say the New York Times had 1,000 front-page stories on the Spanish Civil War, and that there was also like a civil war within the New York Times about the coverage. What was that war like?
That's right. Yeah, the New York Times published more than 1,000 stories, front-page stories about the Spanish Civil War during the period that it raged from mid-1936 to early 1939, and that's more than on any other subject. You know, the re-election of President Roosevelt, the rise of Hitler, the toll of the Great Depression. The Times had correspondents on both sides, and they hated each other. On the Republican side was Herbert Matthews, who was a well-known Times reporter, became a very good friend of Hemingway's in Spain. They used to travel around together, who became a passionate partisan of the Republic. And I think, like Hemingway, was also not willing to recognize when the Republic was losing the war, which it definitely was in the later months. On the nationalist side was a man named William P. Carney, who was a passionate supporter of Franco's Spain and was completely blind to any faults that it might have. And actually, years later, after he left the newspaper, he became a paid lobbyist for Franco's Spain in the United States. And these guys sniped at each other. You know, in the gray columns of the New York Times, you can't, by name, attack another reporter. But there were a couple of times when Carney, who tended not to get as close to the front lines as Matthews, reported that the Nationalists had captured a particular town. Matthews, reading this, was outraged because he knew the Republic still held that town, so he went there, wrote a story, dateline from the town, and said, in this war, you can only verify something by seeing it with your own eyes. So that was an indirect dig at Carney.
So in 1939, after 2.5 years, Franco and his fascist army wins the Spanish Civil War, and he becomes the dictator for the next 36 years. When he first took over Spain, what was his rule like? What kind of laws did he enact?
First of all, education was given back to the Catholic Church, where it was separate education for boys and girls. Girls' education was very heavy on religion and sewing, and the nationalists believed that coeducation was a communist plot of some sort. The laws regarding women were very strict. They couldn't vote. Actually, nobody could vote because there were simply no elections. But a husband had the right to kill his wife if he caught her in the act of committing adultery. A woman needed her husband's permission to travel out of town, to open a bank account, to do various things like that. It was very, very retrograde. There were also all sorts of rules about modesty and dress, no pants for women. The regime that Franco established favored these large landowners who had been his basic backers from the beginning. And he had tens of thousands of Republican prisoners, and he put many of them to work building irrigation canals that would benefit the large landowners, and giant memorials to the nationalist dead of the war. It was a pretty grim police state for 36 years. Torture was routine right up to the very end.
And I guess this comes as no surprise since he was supported by Hitler during the Civil War, but, Franco was also very anti-Semitic.
Absolutely, which is strange because the Jews were famously expelled from Spain in 1492, and very few of them had ever returned. But
I guess he wanted to keep it that way.
Yeah, the rhetoric of Franco and his generals was always the conspiracy lined up against them was a conspiracy of Bolsheviks, Jews, and Masons. They were very opposed to the Freemasons because this had been a traditionally anti-clerical group in Spain.
And in terms of returning education to the church, you described the Spanish Catholic Church as being probably the most conservative of the churches in Europe at the time. I mean, conservative maybe isn't even the right word. You write that the Jesuits in Spain before the Spanish Civil War had republished these anti-Jewish tract, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion.
Right. This was the mentality of the church. It was the most conservative Catholic church in Western Europe, and remained so really throughout Franco's rule.
At the same time, it sounds like the Democratic side during the Spanish Civil War committed some, atrocities against Catholics. They murdered thousands of clergy. They burned down lots of churches.
They did. The war was very nasty on both sides. Nobody has a monopoly in Spain of virtue here. The nationalists are estimated to have carried out 150,000 political murders during the war, and some 20,000 after the war ended. On the Republican side, mobs killed an estimated 49,000 people, including nearly 7,000 members of the clergy. The Republicans hated the Catholic Church because it was looked on as being hand in glove with the large landowners and the big industrialists. So there was a lot of nastiness on both sides.
It's a complicated war, as you say. Some people saw it in terms of black and white. You've got the Democratic side versus the fascist side. But then you also have Stalin's Soviet Union supporting the Democratic side and doing some nasty things. So what were the Soviets responsible for?
Well,
in the Spanish Civil War or in Spain?
Well, Stalin hoped at the beginning that the United States, Britain, and France would sell arms to Spain. But when they didn't do so, he jumped in and began sending arms and sometimes, pilots to fly planes and drivers for the tanks and so on, about 3 or 4 months after the war started. And this was essential help. It prevented Madrid from being captured. And he continued to send quite a lot of arms throughout the war, although after mid-1937, Mussolini's submarines in the Mediterranean began sinking a lot of ships that were carrying arms to Spain, and so the supply began to shrivel up. In return for this help, Stalin demanded high positions in the Spanish army and security forces for Spanish and Soviet communists. And a lot of these folks came to the fore in that time.
If you're just joining us, my guest is journalist Adam Hochschild. His new book is called Spain in Our Hearts, Americans in the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939. Let's take a short break, then we'll talk some more. This is Fresh Air.
WNYC is supported by Blackbird, a new play starring Jeff Daniels and Michelle Williams, now on Broadway at the Belasco Theater for a limited engagement. Tickets and more information available at blackbirdbroadway.com.
Coming up at 3 on WNYC, John Hockenberry and The Takeaway on 93.9 FM and on AMA 20, It's the World.
Support for NPR comes from NPR member stations and from Home Instead Senior Care, providing an individualized approach designed to meet a family's needs, offering a range of in-home care services from help around the house to Alzheimer's care to keep aging loved ones at home. HomeInstead.com/NPR. And from Progressive Insurance, with insurance for cars, home, boat, motorcycles, RVs, and commercial vehicles at 1-800-PROGRESSIVE and Progressive.com.
This is Fresh Air, and if you're just joining us, my guest is Adam Hochschild. We're talking about his new book, Spain in Our Hearts, Americans in the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939. You asked the question, if the U.S., if President Franklin Roosevelt had agreed to sell arms to the Democratic side in Spain, that maybe the Democratic side would have won. Spain would not have become a fascist country. Hitler wouldn't have been victorious in Spain because Hitler was aligned with the fascist side in Spain. And maybe he would have thought twice before invading so many other countries, and he wouldn't have had all the military experience that the Spanish Civil War provided for his troops and the tests that it gave to his new bombers and artillery. So do you think it's possible that if the U.S. had been willing to sell arms to Spain, that World War II wouldn't have happened, or it wouldn't have happened in the same way that it did?
I don't think World War II wouldn't have happened, because Hitler was determined to conquer the world, especially Eastern Europe, the Balkan and Caspian oil fields. This is what he had his eye on, and I think a setback in Spain would not have deterred him from that. But I still think it could have made a difference if the Spanish Republic had won, because during World War II, Franco was sort of a de facto ally for Hitler. He was not officially part of the Axis, but he provided Hitler with a submarine base on the Spanish Atlantic coast, where 21 submarines were based that sunk many American ships and caused many American deaths. He provided bases for reconnaissance aircraft, radio facilities, and he encouraged Spaniards to volunteer for Hitler's army. Some 45,000 of them did so and took part in the Russian campaign. So Hitler would not have had all that help if the Spanish Republic had won the war.
Do you think FDR ever regretted the embargo against selling arms to Spain, to the Democratic side?
He did regret it, because there was a lot of pressure on him during the war from people who'd come back from Spain. Martha Gellhorn, Ernest Hemingway's lover and later wife, was a protege of Mrs. Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt, and was writing to her constantly throughout the war. So there was a lot of pressure on him to do so, and he toyed with the idea a couple of times of getting arms to Spain indirectly somehow or other, because the U.S. had a huge industrial base and a big arms industry. But he knew that isolationism was very strong in the United States. He knew there was no constituency here for getting involved in the Spanish War, and so he backed off and didn't do anything. Finally, a couple months before the war ended, he told a cabinet meeting, "We've made a grave mistake by maintaining the arms embargo." So I think at the end he sort of wished he'd done it differently, but I wish he'd had that realization earlier on.
Well, it sounds like he was also trying to save his political capital for passing parts of the New Deal that he wanted to get passed.
Absolutely, and he'd suffered some setbacks in elections, in the midterm congressional elections of 1938.